The place is a wraparound experience of the medieval, really. Great, powerful, iconographic message, a sort of visceral connection between us and someone 800 years ago doing that drawing. This is something weird and medieval, exactly like your own hall.
There you go, not boring at all. Quite a fabulous window.
Tiny bit boring, but quite important as well.
So I'm here this morning with the famous Matthew Rice, whose books on historic architecture I have leafed through for many an hour. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Very nice to be here. Fun.
And Matthew wrote to me because his church primer is being republished shortly, and if you're interested in historic church architecture, it is a wonderful guide and an introduction to all of the language, the visual language, but also the technical language of churches. And I said we should visit one of Matthew's favourite churches. So Matthew, you've seen thousands of churches across the country and probably across Europe and further afield.
I'm a real crashing church bore, it's quite true. I have seen an awful lot.
Well, you've got a fellow traveller with you today.
Yes.
So why did you choose this church? We're here in Inglesham in Wiltshire at St John the Baptist.
I think that this is a church that tells the history of English churches really better than almost anyone you could imagine, but it's also one that is astonishing because it seems so very ordinary from the outside. You would drive past and think, oh, I don't think so. And it has got rather a remarkable interior. But I think it tells the story of the Reformation, of the developments, architectural and social and liturgical and religious and everything else, and the sort of collapse as well. And I think it's a really perfect example of everything you might want to think with a church. It's a perfect new church for everyone.
We're going to try and take you on a little virtual tour this morning around this special church if you can't visit. The light is absolutely wonderful this morning. It's a very fine day here in England for once. And we are just a mile or so away from Kelmscott, right, which is where William Morris lived. And it's churches like this that actually help to save the heritage of our historic buildings in a way through the creation of SPAB. Could you just talk about that a little bit for us, Matthew?
I think Morris was this great giant of the 19th century. He was one of a group of big men with large beards who changed how we look at buildings and how we look at England. Morris and Pugin, who didn't, of course, have a large beard, and Ruskin, and they are people who completely form the way we think now, still, really, 150 years later, 170 years later. And he lived at Kelmscott, this perfect Cotswold manor on the Thames. It was his absolutely delicious retreat. It's a magical sort of doll's house of a house. And it's only, as you say, a mile along the riverbank from here. And what he found here was an unruined church. And by the time he was looking in the 19th century, there was a lot of change in the church and damage being done to historic fabric. And he started something called SPAB. It was actually originally called the Antiscrape Society because he was so horrified at what was done, the damage being done to the insides of churches under the guise of saving them. And so he set up a new way of thinking, a kind of new orthodoxy about how we look after buildings that was all about preservation and caring for them in their old state, in the way they felt and looked, their texture, for want of I'm sure it's a word he wouldn't have lowered himself to use, although Ruskin got dangerously close to it. But I think he really realised that churches weren't just geometry and classified different sorts of Gothic, but they were actually the history of England told in lime mortar and stone and ancient wood and ancient iron and paint. And this is really the sort of first church that he carefully, painstakingly restored. So that's
it's quite an
feather in his hat.
Unassuming place from the outside, but we'll show you now inside, and that medieval soul has really been retained. So without further ado, why don't we head inside, Matthew?
Here we go. And this is where the whole extraordinary jewel box opens up. This extraordinary box of surprises that's the inside of this church. And you just have no idea when you're standing outside that you're going to be in this complete sort of church lover's wonderland fantasy interior where every single little feature and idea and practice and shape and curve and twist and cusp, and every single bit of church architecture is here in one form or another. It's an extraordinary entry.
Well, I spent about an hour and a half trying to photograph this place when I first came, and this morning I spent about half an hour before you arrived, and it's just impossible because there is a photo in every single corner, and the light is just overwhelming.
The light's amazing because it isn't troubled with stained glass, and because some of the glass is also, very good, sort of post-Reformation clear. Where's a house window? The window over there is just like a window in a house. But also it's a series of views through. There are so many wonderful sort of glimpses around a corner, through a screen, through one arch, through another, past a pew, to an arch, going right round into the altar. It is hard to photograph. You find yourself photographing completely flat things because they're such good examples, but the place is a wraparound experience of the medieval, really.
And in the spirit of the church primer, what we said we'd do this morning is go through 10 of Matthew's highlights from this church of highlights, and we try and give you a little bit of a flavour for the architecture of the building, what you might find in other churches, what's unique to this place, St John the Baptist in Inglesham in Wiltshire. So let's take a look and go into the nave. So Matthew, for the uninitiated, can you explain
what's a nave?
What is a nave? Because it's so baffling, some of this language, to people who just don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot of terminology. Otherwise, people just go out and say, people write in the book, this peaceful place. There's so much more to it than that. So the nave is the ship. It's the middle.
So that's from the Latin,
church.
right?
Comes from navis, a ship, and because it's got this upturned, as it were, keel of a ship as the roof. And it's the main room in a church. It's the main area. And interestingly, it's not a sacred area. It's a secular area. It's where you might do other things like have meetings. It's a sort of community middle of a village, the nave. And you can do all sorts of things in a nave that you can't do in the chancel, which is that end up there, which is the sort of business end, the hot end of the church. We're in the cold end here, where basically you just listen and enjoy and pay attention to what's going on. And historically, there would have been no pews. There wouldn't have been wonderful box pews like this, and there wouldn't have been horrid little plastic chairs, and there wouldn't have been anything at all. You just would have hung around most of the time, or possibly sat on a simple bench somewhere and listen. And the church service, the actual Eucharist, the Mass, was happening up there in the business end of the church. So we're in the nave, and it's the middle. It's the great room. It's the drawing room of the church.
Number 2 is box pews. So we're sat in these pews, Matthew. On my Instagram, people absolutely love a box pew, but I feel like sometimes the social history behind them isn't really understood. Can you give us a little piece on when they were introduced and what they meant to the people who occupied these churches?
Yes. I mean, this church has got an astonishing collection of woodwork. It's just screens, pews and everything. But pews really come into their own, these box pews, after the Reformation, when the church is changing its spirit completely and people start telling long and boring sermons from the pulpit, at which point people need somewhere to sit. I once used to go to a church with very tall box pews. I had 3 small girls at the time, and you could have a fully operational Barbie show happening underneath, and the priest could never see what was going on inside. And they are a place, they're also a sort of very key part of a kind of hierarchical idea of the parish, of the Lord of the Manors pew, of indeed sold pews. I mean, there are churches where you would buy your pew, and in some places, Amsterdam, for example, there are great accounts of everybody buying their pews. So private pews, public pews, and on the whole, hiding what's happening down below, so you might have somewhere to keep warm. Some of them even have fires in them. This doesn't. This is just straightforward, chilly, old church pews, but they're probably mid-17th century, and they've just got the most lovely feeling of faded, old, delicious oak.
And so this comes from the time of the primacy of the word, of the sermons, when people are sat here for many hours, possibly on cold mornings, making themselves as comfortable as possible to go through the service together.
And possibly not entirely voluntary. I mean, I think what one knows about the 17th century and the sort of ferocious power of Cromwell's Protestant religion in Britain is that people jolly well had to come. And we all know there wasn't Christmas and no turkeys and you weren't allowed to play bowls or I don't know, whatever else you were allowed to go mumming anymore, but you did go to church. And so churches, which sometimes had almost no seating, suddenly sprouted box pews like a housing estate on the edge of a town now. There they all were, popping up like this.
And they're so worn and beautiful. I think that's why people love them as much as anything. Beautiful woodwork. Okay, let's move on. Number 3, we're going to go way back in history now to a sculpture which is, I believe, possibly Saxon, Matthew, of the Virgin and Child. Now, how come this is here when the rest of the church isn't quite so old?
Well, I mean, the answer is that early churches, particularly Saxon churches, very likely to have been principally wood and thatch, and churches get demolished and they get rebuilt, great rebuildings, particularly when the Normans come to Britain in 1066. There's something called the Great Rebuilding, and lots of things become stone, but a lot of this is 12th and 13th century. So this is something that predates that, possibly by 500 years. And the number of real Saxon revivals in Britain are small. I mean, you know all those churches, they're marvellous and they've got great characteristics. Some of them even feel as if they're listening back to ancient Rome. You can get this strange echo and you can just hear a little bit of a column, a little bit of a pilaster, and you can realise that there's still some distant memory of Roman Britain. But the Saxons came here, and they were skillful craftsmen, rather more skillful in a way than the Normans. I mean, they worked with stone very beautifully, and here's the Blessed Virgin, and it's in fact a really beautifully expressive piece of carving, and if you look closely, you see her dolorous expression and her eyes and her look of concern. We can't really see much of the infant Christ, but as a great bit of iconography, you can see Maria written there, again in what, if it was in Rome, you'd think of as very late classical writing. Yeah. But you look there, and there is the hand of God, Manus Dei, looking down, pointing and saying, Ecce homo, this is the man. And that hand of God is actually pointing out Jesus. All this religious imagery is incredibly significant in spreading Christianity around England. After all, Saxon England was originally pagan Saxon England. It became Christianized partially because of missionaries coming from Rome, partially because it was the new thing, and landlords and owners and great men of Saxon Britain adopted Christianity, as they did all around Europe. And it was almost a badge of modernity as well. But the imagery was a way of speaking to the population who were illiterate, who didn't read, and who needed images, whether they were painted or carved. Well, we can't see Saxon painted images, but we can see carved stonework where a message, this great powerful iconographic message of the mother and the child, and this hand, as I said, the hand of God pointing to Jesus. So it is a really clear way of explaining to the population what lies at the very centre of their faith. And it will no doubt have been referred to by all sorts of priests, but it won't have been referred to in a language they could understand because they were talking in Latin all the time. So the imagery really mattered. You might see this slightly random hole and a series of radiating inscribed lines there. That's because this was re-employed as a sundial outside. One of the reasons it's quite tired looking on the outside is it was outside. It was brought in 1910 and put in this position. You can see the sort of fixings of where it was put in. So brought in to look after itself, but there's been none of the kind of tidying up you might expect. Hasn't been recut or anything.
Is it the case that there would have been a stick put in here, and the religious hours as the sun went round would have been shown?
It was hard to know when the next, when the next train was coming, as it were. So you needed to have a thing of saying when the next service was and what time it was, and so it was a traditional proper sundial.
And this is a fantastic piece, obviously, but it always surprises me just how many survivals there are from the Saxon period in sculpture. We were saying before we started filming that this does look similar to Deerhurst in Gloucestershire.
Deerhurst, I mean, that's really, Deerhurst is what I was thinking about when I was saying there's a sort of quotation from the classical because the surroundings of that window really does have a sort of pedimented window with two pilasters.
So this is one of the great Saxon churches, for those who don't know.
You know, Wearmouth, I've just temporarily, my mind's gone entirely sort of spongy and blank, but the one in Northamptonshire with these great lezines, these great stone strips that go down the outside, and these are all slightly misheard quotations of classical architecture. There, people think, hang on a second, I know they used to do something.
See that here.
And you can see it with that lettering, because if you think of Saxon lettering, it's nothing like that.
No.
It's cursive, and it's complex, and it feels sort of Celtic, and it feels much more mystical and Viking-y later and everything else. That is Roman writing. Who knows? I mean, the other great thing is who carved it. Such an exciting thought that these anonymous great sculptors. I mean, Henry Moore would have felt very, indeed, you know, because someone told you that was early Henry Moore, you would absolutely think, oh, well, fair enough.
And here it is.
And here it is.
Well, let's move on. Let's keep the theme back in history, and let's go to some of the earliest wall paintings here and discover the origins of the anti-scrape movement. Number 4. So this is an unassuming piece within the church, this little bit of chiselled away plasterwork here, but this is absolutely critical to the history of England, to saving our heritage, and the anti-scrape movement. So could you explain for us what that is, Matthew?
Yes, well, William Morris, who lived at Kelmscott, just a few miles downstream from here, saw the extraordinary revolution that was happening to the buildings of the church in England in the mid-19th century, and he did not like what he saw. He saw plaster knocked off the walls, he saw capitals recut, he saw arches tidied up, he saw broken glass, which had been trashed in the Reformation, replaced with shiny new chemical colours. He saw metalwork made in Birmingham, a kind of industrial revolution that was taking place in the inside of the churches, and he was sad to see the magic of the old buildings of the church being treated like this. And so he coined the phrase the anti-scrape movement, which was against scraping plaster off the wall. And you see it in churches all over the place. The idea, you go into a lovely church like this and you can see bare stone everywhere. Never intended. It's just like looking at the plasterboard in your house. It's an extraordinarily odd idea, but it was very dominant. It was a real orthodoxy in mid and late 19th century Britain. So here we can see exactly the opposite. We can see the anti-scrape movement in action. These lines here, these red sort of ox-bloody lines that go across the lime plastering here, are there to make the thing look grand. So underneath there, it's just rubble, it's just old stones piled up together with mortar. But this is a beautiful geometric imitation of the grandest cathedral in the country. And it's done with these beautiful straight ruled lines, and it went straight across the stone. There's no change. You can see where this plaster went over. It's just randomly cut back there because it probably flaked away completely, but it happens all the way through. And if you go up there, you can see this grid, this bond. I suppose you'd call it stretcher bond if it was bricks now, but you can see it all round the church, and it was to make the building higher status. It was a way of saying, this is not your barn or your cottage or your shed or your farmhouse or even your manor, although they were also rendered outside quite often, but saying this is the most important, this is the focus for expenditure, this church, and they all are, because that's where everything happened. But these are really important, and the preservation of that, the fact that you can't see the naked stone beneath, is A, one of the glories of this church, and B, is totally at the centre of the sort of best practice that we now have of looking after old buildings.
And it was after coming to churches like this that Morris went on to found the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, which are still at the very heart of the best practice of building conservation, not only for churches, but for private building owners, for big stately homes, all sorts of heritage buildings in this country and further afield. So from these humble beginnings, actually a heritage revolution was sparked thanks to the energy of Morris and his friends in wanting to maintain that original soul of this place. Number 5, so we've not got an object of such, but we've got a feeling. I often talk about the accretions of history at the churches I visit, the many layers, and this must be one of the best examples in the country of those layers. So Matthew, you wanted to draw attention particularly to this few square feet here, and why was that?
But yeah, if you talk about accretion, I think I'm going to turn it round and talk about an onion and talk about peeling back the layers. Because churches, because they are built up of so many different periods, so many centuries of work, become what you call a palimpsest, this idea of a whole series of one layer on top of another, one layer occluding the one before, so you can't see. But here, you can just see, and if you look on this wall here, you see so many different stories, starting from a very early medieval scheme, this rather chic sort of red and white stripe, and then you go through, you can see here, later medieval, there's a consecration cross in there, which has also been painted over, and then here, there's part of a reredos, which was the great backing to the altar, which is a high Gothic piece, and you can see the figures here, their beautiful feet and their clothes, you know, the folds and the clothing and these beautifully carved things. There's a sort of Umbria cupboard behind there, and then again, right on top again is some post-Reformation writing, which is totally superimposed on top. So literally each time it's whitewashed over and done again. And so this is such a good illustration of the onion peeled, or partially peeled onion, but of the palimpsest. It's such a nice word. It sounds like it's something just delicious, doesn't it? The palimpsest of a church, where you're seeing all the different layers of wallpaper hanging off your bedroom.
I think I'm going to add this to my vocabulary now, the palimpsest concept. And seeing these words here make me think of Binham Priory in Norfolk, where the saints, you can actually see the pre-Reformation saints peering almost ghostly figures behind the 17th century text that's been added over the top.
Yes, I mean, the key to this is just, in case anyone's not absolutely up there, is that the Reformation basically gets rid of magic in the church. And the whole glory of the mystical extraordinary tenets of faith, that there's this extraordinary idea of there being God and saints and people in heaven and angels, the company of heaven, and then this extraordinary idea again that when the blood is raised up, the wine turns into the blood of Christ and the bread turns into his body. This is the magic of the medieval church, and this is utterly at odds with the Reformation, where this great blinding white Northern European light comes shooting through at the church, and it wipes away all the magic, and it leaves this funny alkaline sort of whitewashed idea of the Word instead, of the Word of Christ. And everybody's relationship has to be, instead of it being mediated through the saints, through the angels, through prayer, through all sorts of indulgences, through a whole world of complexity, suddenly there's this very simple relationship, me and my God. And that's such a change, and that is reflected in the building of churches with limewash, and with the loss of complexity and depth and magic, and with the replacement with the Word of God.
And that's why your book is so important, because if you know what you're looking at, you can feel, you can see all of this history, the revolutions, the gut feelings of these places, which maybe if you just looked, you wouldn't know.
I think you'd walk past and think, how nice, that's very nice. But I mean, you can't overemphasize the extraordinary effect on the people of Britain of the Reformation. And while there were all sorts of different reasons for it, and big political undertows, and desire not to give money to Rome, and change Henry VIII's marital status, and all sorts of other things, deep down there was that big change from magic to reason. And in that, it had such an effect. One of the things that went was on All Hallows Night, the day before All Saints' Day, the name of every person who had ever died in the parish was read out. So there was a listing of all souls, of everybody who had lived there, and it might take all night for the clerks, if you had good paperwork in your church, to read through the names of all those people. It's such a sort of central bit of the idea of community and of holding everything together. And its loss must have been, as well as this loss of all the imagery, all the saints, all the magic.
You must be familiar with Eamon Duffy's The Stripping of the Altars, which is, if you get really into this topic after reading the Church Primer, maybe that's another one to get as well,
wonderful.
because he really talks about that sense of, almost a bereft sense in some communities of the loss of the calendar, the religious calendar in the year. But we should probably move on, or else we'll never get through our top 10. Number 6, so you might find these in churches, not in all churches, but I find a surprising number of them during my travels, and they're often very old because they are consecration crosses, which are, Matthew?
Well, they were put by a bishop when a church was consecrated, and when it was made, it was reactivated.
It was made official.
Yeah, or when it was redecorated or replanned at various points. And sometimes they're very simple. This is rather a complex one. And it's just a beautiful piece of medieval work. You could imagine it almost being a sort of illuminated capital in a psalter or something. It's a very, very Gothic thing, and it's got these beautiful shapes, and you can see the compass point was put in there, and these lines were drawn around it, and it's quite a complex piece of design. We saw the one over there, which is again slightly different. Often it's just a red cross in a disc, but these are, I suppose, signs of this being a high-status church.
So some point in the 13th century, most likely, there was a chap here carefully drawing this out, painting it, ready for the bishop to come down and an official statement that the church is open for spiritual business.
It is that, but it's also something exciting that you can literally, it's so immediate, you can picture the man putting his nail in there, getting his piece of string and his pencil and doing it. It's such a sort of visceral connection between us and someone 800 years ago doing that drawing. And if you draw yourself, you can say, oh, yes, there's someone else doing exactly what I did, but 800 years ago. And it's right there. It's got a lot of immediacy to it.
Number 7 on our list is arches. So one of the reasons that I love Matthew's book, The Church Primer, is because I'm always referring to it to check my dating of different architectural features, windows, arches. And here, actually, at Inglesham, we have a great example of 2 different styles of arches. So we have this more rounded arch here, slightly more pointed. What do arches tell us about the dating of churches?
I mean, more or less exactly what you say. That as we go through the medieval period, arches become first round, then they become a bit pointed, then very pointed, and then they gradually flatten out again until they disappear entirely. And so you can map the 500 years of Gothic architecture through their arches. An architect called Rickman in the very early 19th century gave them some names, Norman, early English, decorated, and perpendicular as his. They were just, nobody thought they were being, oh God, we're going to be a bit more perpendicular now. We really have cracked the early English style. That was never an issue at the time. It was just making masonry. It was masons working. But he was trying to tabulate Gothic architecture into something you could get your head round once antiquarians, people who were interested in the old, really wanted to begin to understand that things weren't just the pointed style. Pugin called it the pointed style, funnily enough. But if you look here, it's not just arches, then there's the capital. So these great sort of floreate capitals, these leaves, these naturalistic carved things, which are great expressions of a sort of human vision of the world around them. They're stylized, of course, but those are a kind of oak leaf, and these probably are a very, very sort of distressed idea of a Roman capital. And this is something weird and medieval and almost sort of Norse as an idea. So I think the capitals are the great focus of expression, and the arches, I suppose, are the expression of engineering, of trying to work out how do you, I mean, arches really are just how do you cover a space, how do you make not a horrible stone box, but a beautiful, airy space with windows. How do you make walls that are intrinsically strong enough to put a window in? And off the back of arches comes tracery, which could be number 8.
Okay, and would we say this is sort of 12th century to your right? Yeah. And then over here we're moving 13th.
Yeah, I don't think they're very different, but yes. Number 8 comes straight off number 7 and is tracery. Tracery is the division of a field, of an area, into geometric shapes. So this arch, this Gothic arch, in this 15th century manifestation, has then been divided into 3 sections. So it's tripartite, and then they have, again, that's 3 leaves, so that's a trefoil, as those would have been, and then they've got a beautiful sort of leafy finial to the edge of that, and in this area here, or here, that's what you call the spandrel, which is the bit in between the arch and the frame, there is a triangle. It's quite simple tracery, but you might get it in a window, or in this case in a screen, and it's a sort of decorative grammar of how you break up a plain area and make it something complicated, as is all mouldings here. There are a whole load of different names, Tauruses and Echinuses and all sorts of things, but how you make all these different vertical divisions, which we call orders, make it more graceful, and then you get more elaborate carving into here. But tracery, I think, is the thing, and this is beautiful in this church. These are so elegantly, carefully carved, beautiful bits of medieval woodwork.
Number 9. So this is the type of thing that happens when you're out with a church history buff. Matthew got very excited about this window and wanted to drag us towards this side of the church and cover it. So Matthew, what is it about this window in particular that's exciting?
It does sound so boring, doesn't it? Obviously the main thing is the light is pouring in through this window, and this is the ultimate post-Reformation window. There's no coloured glass, there's no leading, there's just an ordinary house window, and the light, the sort of clarity of the Reformation is pouring down. I mean, it's in this great, marvellous sort of palimpsest wall, where you can see one great text in a 16th century frame, and then there's a medieval frame that goes behind it straight through something else. So you're seeing a very complex sort of patchwork of ideas behind there. But the window has got a little bit less bright light now, but is this real indication, first of all, of light coming in, also of saying the church is just another part of your life. It's not the magical part, it's just the part where you're talking to God. And so it can have a window exactly like your own hall.
There you go, not boring at all. Quite a fabulous window.
Tiny bit boring, but quite important as well.
And we're getting there, so let's move on to number 10. If you see this symbol and the name, the Church's Conservation Trust, on a church, that will be because it is cared for by the Church's Conservation Trust, who look after many abandoned churches that are no longer in regular use, and they do fantastic work. They need your help. And Matthew, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the Church's Conservation Trust and how you've seen them operate over the years.
Yeah, it's a brilliant, brilliant body. It used to have a much better name. It used to be called the Redundant Churches Commission, which nobody ever forgot. It was such a good idea. And then in this ridiculous rebranding way everyone loves to do, it got a logo like everything else and a name like everything else. But it is an extraordinarily important organisation because it looks after hundreds and hundreds of architecturally significant buildings, as you say, that aren't in regular worship, although they tend to have at least 1 or 2 services a year, and people can still marry in them and, with permission, use them. So they are still consecrated in a way, in that they're still the places in which people have some worship, but they're safe, they're looked after in a way like churches in France or Italy, which are looked after by the government. Whereas in England, as you know, they're looked after by each parish. So they're a brilliant thing, and they definitely, if you like what they've done here, then support them. Give them some money. Go online, look on their website, the Church's Conservation Trust. Wish it was called the Redundant Churches Commission, and then join them. They've got supporters and friends and all sorts of things. They're a really admirable charity.
And some of the very best churches with the best atmosphere are Church's Conservation Trust, primarily because they're in places like this. We're just in a tiny hamlet, it's hidden away, and there's never going to be a population centre here to support worship anymore, but all of that history is still here. You can experience it. So if you go on their website, you can also find county by county where to visit. And by and large, a Churches Conservation Trust visit is always a good one. So yeah, Churches Conservation Trust. I've visited thousands of churches now, and my journey into church crawling began about 10 years ago. At that time, I didn't know any of the technical language behind these fascinating buildings. One of the first points I turned to was the famous Rice's Church Primer, which we have here. I think my parents bought me a copy. I didn't know then that I'd be sitting here with the Matthew Rice. So can you explain why this book was the right book for me and other fellow history enthusiasts?
When I wrote it for you, that's the first thing, it was absolutely that. I wanted to write an illustrator book that allowed you to go out of a church talking about it and allowed you to learn the very basic language of all the different parts, the sort of naming of parts, that helped you understand what you were looking at, and then you could say, I like this more than that because it's a bit more like this and more like that, and instead of saying, oh, this is a curly bit with a straight bit underneath, you could say this is a floreate capital on top of a solid pier, whatever. So I did a book which really was just a series of diagrams, age by age, and trying to say, which bit of the church is which, and it's very basic, which is why it's called a primer, because it's just like the first base of learning about churches. There are much more erudite books, just as there are much more erudite people to write them. But this is, I hope, super accessible, but relatively sort of full on, so that you can understand what you're looking at. And it's a sort of history of the church as well, because it explains a little bit what happened over the centuries to the church in England.
And what I found with this book is that when you understand that basic language, you can unlock the real stories behind the history, the social history, the economic history, the feelings of people who've been in these buildings. And so it's so important. I can't recommend it enough. We actually sell quite a lot of them in Sherlock and Pages. So a little bit of a plug for our bookshop. You can buy it on sherlockandpages.com. And there's a reprinting, right?
This is as we speak, as we're sitting here in the lovely, lovely summery sun in Inglesham, somewhere in a printing works in Italy or somewhere further away, they are busy knocking out church primers, which are going to be coming on a ship to England very soon.
Okay, and I'll be getting them on a box in my little book.
You in a lovely little box in your lovely bookshop, and I hope you'll all buy them.
So it's a wonderful present for anyone as well who knows that a family member is interested in church history. You've also got a series of other books, right? Could you tell us a little bit about your journey into these illustrated architectural books? Which came first, and where have you gone since?
Well, to be absolutely true, the first one was a book about Norfolk, where I lived at the time. There wasn't a good book about the buildings of Norfolk, so I wrote a quite sort of thorough but illustrated, because what I do is paint. That's my sort of principal thing. So I wrote a book about that called Building Norfolk, and really it was, again, architecture is what we leave behind. It's the evidence of each period. There's nothing else left much except buildings, and they are our dreams all the time. So our house is our dreams, just like they are now, and our church is the dreams of a community, and a great house is the dreams of a great man. And so it is what gets left behind, and it really, really explains a period. So I was writing, I suppose, a social history of Norfolk as well. Then I did one about Stoke-on-Trent, where I've worked. But again, it was exciting because it was a book that hadn't been written, and it has an extraordinary history, and that's all told in buildings, which is better than telling it in photographs of men in black bowler hats, who all look the same. And then I did first a primer of architecture, a general one, which is now called the Rice's Language of Buildings.
Also available at sherlockandpages.com.
Particularly well, easily found there. And that is a more general sort of glossary of architectural terms as a way of helping people understand buildings. And then I did this one, and I've done a book on Oxford and Venice and Rome. So I
Any more in the pipeline?
Oh, yes.
Yeah?
Absolutely.
Any you can talk about, or is that all up your sleeve?
It's all up my sleeve, but
Okay.
I'm heading towards an architectural atlas at the moment.
Okay.
So-
And can I ask a question?
Yes.
I've always wondered, I hope this doesn't come across the wrong way.
Me too.
Do you think the publishers have been surprised by the knockout success of the Church Primer and the other books? Did you even envisage the success? 'Cause
No.
I think in our little niche world, this is kind of, a real prime textbook.
It's funny that these, particularly the primer and the church primer, have been reprinted several times, and they're both being done again, and the language of buildings is being reprinted several times. And actually, I did a book called Village Buildings of Britain 30 years ago, which got printed in all sorts of different formats. So I think they're a bit surprising, but I think people love buildings.
Yeah.
And they love going around churches. People really love it. I mean, while we've been doing this, there have been people coming in, lady from Australia, a man to take photographs, a neighbour, all that kind of thing. People are, that business of going around churches, it's such a good focus for a day out, it's such a good focus for travelling.
Well, I think also they can be so baffling as buildings, the language of them, and this is a very down-to-earth book. I think people look at this book and they think, oh, actually, this is approachable. I can look at the different illustrations and I can get a rough idea of the periods and the architectural forms. So I think you've done a wonderful service to all of us enthusiasts, and I will do my very best, notably out of some self-interest, but also enthusiasm, to sell as many as I can at Sherlock and Pages. And Matthew, it is a real honour and a pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for your time today.
What a lovely morning.
Okay.